Hey family, welcome back to Kingdom South Plus, where we work the words of Jesus beyond Sunday. If this is your first time here, my name is Pastor Sean. I'm grateful that you're listening to this wherever you get your podcast. Yesterday was a good day. It was week 2 of our Gender Wars series for men. And I shared perhaps the most important message of the series. So I can't wait to share this week's recap with you. Yesterday's message was about what I believe is one of the greatest vices affecting modern Christians, regardless of gender, and that is lust, which we define as desire detached from God's design. Desire detached from God's design. So since we're a Jesus church, and by that I simply mean we place a considerable amount of emphasis on the life and teachings of Jesus, we chose to go to Matthew's Gospel, chapter number 5, verses 27 and 28 as our foundational text. I want to read it just so that you're clear as you're listening to this recap on what we covered. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Matthew chapters 5 through 7 mark the beginning of Jesus' most famous teaching, known as the Sermon on the Mount. It is his most robust teaching on life in the kingdom of God, or as we affectionately call it at Kingdom South, life as God intended. Now, where we tend to differ from others is in how we understand what Jesus is doing in this sermon. For many people, the Sermon on the Mount is little more than a collection of rules, commands, and moral expectations. But for us, it is far more than that. It is a picture of an entirely new way to be human. Or put another way, Jesus' sermon is fundamentally about human flourishing. This is what Jonathan Pennington, who's a professor of New Testament interpretation, says about this sermon. The sermon, as he calls it, is Christianity's answer to the greatest metaphysical question humanity has ever faced. How can we experience human flourishing? What is happiness, blessedness, and peace, and how does one obtain and sustain it? This is important because we believe at Kingdom South that Jesus didn't just come to get us to heaven. He came to teach us how to be human. And I felt it necessary to make a distinction between our humanity and our sinful nature. Because depending on how you were raised, depending on your level of religious exposure, maybe you've been led to believe that to be human is to be sinful. Now, I don't want you to mishear me. I want to be clear. Yes, humans are fallen and we are apt to sin. But humanity shouldn't be synonymous with sin because God created us with appetites, longings, and instincts that move us toward the things necessary for life and flourishing. We hunger for food. We thirst for water. We desire intimacy. We seek connection. We pursue beauty, and we long for purpose. Desire is not evidence of brokenness. Desire is evidence that we are alive. To be human is to possess desires that, when rightly ordered, help us live the kind of life God intended. That's side A. Then there's side B, our sin nature, which is what happens when those God-given desires become distorted and detached from God's design. Sin does not create desire. Sin corrupts desire. It takes something good and reorients it, causing us to prioritize personal gratification over wisdom and obedience. The problem is not what we want. The problem is that our wants sometimes are no longer being governed by God. Here's the big point. Desires make us human, but decisions determine the kind of human we will be. Again, depending on how you grew up, for you, maybe you've been led to believe that humanity and sin nature are synonymous. They are not. Desires make us human. Decisions determine the kind of human we will be. Again, we hunger for food. That's not sin. We thirst for water. That's not sin. We desire intimacy. That's not sin. We seek connection. That's not sin. We pursue beauty. That's not sin. We long for purpose. That's not sin. Those things make us human. Now, how we go about satisfying those desires determine the kind of human we will be. So I love this particular passage captured in Matthew's gospel. I love it even more in a translation that is less talked about. It's called New Testament for Everyone. It's a translation that was given to us by N.T. Wright. Those of you who are familiar with New Testament, familiar with the theological space, you know N.T. Wright. He does a fantastic job, I believe, of capturing the essence of the original Greek in a way that some of our other translations don't for certain verses. This is how he translates Matthew 5 verses 27 and 28. You heard, Jesus continued, that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone who gazes at a woman in order to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So there are a couple of things that I want to make mention of, even in this recap, just so that we're clear, because our mission here at Kingdom South is we want to take Jesus's words and not just hear them, not just admire them. We want to put them into practice. And if our doctrine, if our theology is off, then it's going to affect our ability to put it into practice. So we got to be clear on not just what Jesus is saying, but also what he's not saying. So there's some who they read the Sermon on the Mount, especially this series of contrasts that Jesus is making, and they assume that he is arguing that they're the same. So before he talks about adultery and lust, he talks about murder and anger. And if we're not careful, we can assume that he is saying they are the same thing. I don't believe that that's what Jesus is saying. I believe Jesus is trying to show us the progressive nature of sin. That one represents fruit. The other represents a seed. Because very often the seed for murder is anger. Very often the seed for adultery is lust. So Jesus is not saying that they're the same. Jesus is also not saying that everyone who sees someone who is attractive is lusting. This is why I love this New Testament for Everyone translation by N.T. Wright, because he helps us to see everyone who gazes at a woman in order to lust after her, which speaks to intent, because you can't help but see somebody who's in front of you. You can't help but see somebody who's walking by. So Jesus is not saying that every time you see a woman, every time you see someone attractive, that you're lusting. This word gaze, in order to lust, is important. Gazes in order to lust. The intent is not just I saw them, it's I kept looking. David didn't just see Bathsheba, he kept looking. It's the idea of forming in the imagination an image. Forming in the imagination an image. So here, Jesus is trying to get the original audience and our modern audience to see that sin is not merely about outward behavior. It is about the inward condition of the heart that gives way to it. Although the law prohibited adultery as an act, Jesus goes deeper to show us that disordered desire can begin shaping a person long before any physical action takes place. Which means his concern here is not simply sexual ethics, but the kind of person we are becoming through what we entertain, desire, and repeatedly give our attention to. So again, Jesus makes it clear that desire itself is not the problem. The problem arises when desire becomes detached from God's design and begins to govern our lives. Lust is dangerous because it trains us to consume rather than love, to objectify rather than honor, and to pursue gratification without wisdom or restraint. So again, our aim, we want to take his word, we want to put it into practice. We can't put it into practice if we don't clarify what Jesus is saying by being intentional in communicating what he's not saying. Because again, if our theology is off, our practice is going to be off. So Jesus is not saying that they're the same. He's not saying that lust and adultery are the same thing. He's talking about fruit and seed. And he's not saying that every look is lustful. He's saying when we're gazing in order to lust, gazing in order to form in the imagination an image, that's when we're off track. So I want to share the three practical things that I mentioned in the message yesterday, and hopefully, even if you're not a part of our spiritual family, this can add some value to your Jesus journey. Because again, I think this is one of the greatest vices for modern Christians. It just is. I've been doing this a long time. So aside from my own personal experiences, my pastoral experiences, which are informed through the experiences of others, have led me to this conclusion. It is one of the greatest vices for modern Christians. So let's get practical. It's one thing to hear what Jesus said, but I want us to explore the implications associated with Jesus' words. Here's number one. Lust will lead you. Lust will lead you. One of the most dangerous things about lust is that it often convinces us that our desires are trustworthy simply because they are strong. I want you to think about the kind of culture that we live in, guys. We live in a culture that tells us to follow our hearts. But then the Bible tells a very different story. Jeremiah 17:9 reminds us that the heart can be deceptive, meaning our desires are not always pointing us toward what is good, wise, or life-giving. Lust has a way of leading us down paths we never intended to walk, because once desire takes control, discernment often disappears. One of the things I mentioned yesterday, it wants to drive the car. It does not want to ride. Lust wants to drive the car. It wants to lead us. And if we're not careful, if the only standard for measuring right and wrong is passion, we can find ourselves in trouble. Because we can think that just because we feel strongly about something, it must be right. And I want you to hear me as you're listening to this, maybe on a treadmill, as you're listening to this at work, on a lunch break, as you're listening to this, maybe to wind down your evening. I want you to hear me. I will never tell someone that their feelings aren't real, which is how we end up losing a lot of people, because we want to call into question the authenticity of their feelings. No, your feelings can be real. The question isn't, are they real? The question is, are they right? Not asking, do you feel that way? Sometimes the question is, should you feel that way? So spiritual maturity then is not about learning to suppress desire, which is what we've been teaching people, and I just don't think it works. Just denying that you have desire, that don't work. Here's what I think we should be doing. I think we should be learning to question whether every desire deserves our obedience. So yes, you may feel that, but just because you feel it, should you obey it? Just because it wants to lead you doesn't mean you should allow it to. Number 2, lust will lie to you. Lust distorts perception, which is especially dangerous because it often causes us to confuse attraction with compatibility. Now, this is the part of the message where I got real honest. Because again, not just in my own personal experiences, in my pastoral experience, which is informed by the experiences of others, this is a problem. One of the ways that lust lies to us is it convinces us that attraction, specifically sexual attraction, equates to relational compatibility. It does not. And maybe I'm the first pastor to say this out loud, but it needs to be said. You are going to be sexually attracted to way more people than you are relationally compatible with. I know if you don't go to Kingdom South, if you didn't hear this message live, you probably clutching your pearls. But I meant everything I just said. You are going to be sexually attracted to way more people than you're relationally compatible with. And that needs to be said, because without it, people will use sexual attraction as a discerning tool. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be attracted to the person you want to be with. I'm not saying that at all. We're not playing those games. But we all know that varies in terms of attraction and how important it is. It varies from person to person. It depends on how high it is on your list. What I am saying is, it cannot become your only tool for discerning. Because there are people who are good in bed and bad at life. And the quality of your relational life is going to be predicated on their ability to do life, not just their ability to roll around in bed. A person can stimulate your desires while being completely misaligned with your values, your purpose, and your future. So this means we cannot simply pick people who are good for the moment. We have to do some additional work to investigate whether or not this person will be good for me over time. And then number 3, lust will leave you. It will lead you, it will lie to you, and number 3, it will leave you. The tragedy of lust is that it always promises more than it can deliver. It convinces us that satisfaction is found in possession, pleasure, or external beauty, but those things were never designed to sustain us. Proverbs 31:30 reminds us that the things we often build desire around are by nature temporary. Beauty fades, excitement diminishes, novelty disappears, and what once captivated us eventually loses its power. So anything built entirely on lust will eventually leave you empty because it can never offer more than temporary gratification. Whatever you feel, you won't feel it always. So if it's all you have, if it is the driving force for your decision, if it is your primary discerning tool, it will leave you. Now, as I land this plane for this week's recap, I want to make mention of something that I think is just very important. So, of course, this is Men's Month, so this message fit into that calendar, and even Jesus directing this toward men was very important. Now, we're not playing any games. We know that lust is not gender specific, because there are men who don't struggle with lust, and there are women who do. So yesterday's message wasn't about assuming that all men struggle with lust. It wasn't about assuming that women don't. Here's what I think is interesting and why Jesus directs this toward men. He wanted to and wants to establish the kind of kingdom where women feel safe. And if we're honest, of course there are exceptions, but if we're honest, more often than not, lust tends to drive men. And because specifically here in the West, America, men have been in the driver's seat in terms of leadership and power and influence. So if something like lust is driving men, and those men have influence and power and money, it can easily create the kind of climate where women don't feel safe. And Jesus wanted his apprentices to know, those male apprentices, that's not how we do in the kingdom. All right, that's all I got time for this week. I know this is a different kind of recap. Again, if you didn't hear this live, you probably clutching your pearls like, what are they talking about over there? Here's my conviction. Here's my belief. We're a formation-focused church. We want to do our best to help people to work the words of Jesus into their lives. That requires changing your life. You can't help people change their life without talking about the things that impact their life. So yes, this message makes people uncomfortable, but it is a message that is absolutely, positively necessary because, again, I believe it is one of the greatest vices for modern Christians. So I've got one ask of you. It's my only ask. And that is, if this added any value to your Jesus journey, would you help me help more people? Would you send this to someone that you know could benefit from this recap? Until next time, this is Kingdom South Plus, where we work the words of Jesus beyond Sunday.